It's the Packet Thrower! Welcome to the channel! I do a lot of labbing with VMware Workstation. It's handy to spin up simple VMs and do my testing as I need to, or make some videos. But one of the annoying things about it is that it isn't as feature-rich as the full VMware products like with vCenter. So for example, I have about 8 routers in this router folder, and we'll be focusing on these guys for this video. And if I wanted to start them all there, I can't do shift and select them all or anything like that, and there's no special folder options in VMware Workstation like there is with the ESX variety. So I would have to manually start each one of these up there. And at the end of the day, that's not a terribly big deal, but I was thinking to myself, this might be a decent way to start introducing RESTful API conversations. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the VMware Workstation API to start up some VMs, and then we'll walk through different ways of working with that API, and we'll end things off by making a Python script that will turn all these guys on or off for us. So that should be fun. So we do have to do some setup to actually get the API working, and I'm just going to open up my Windows terminal. The first thing we need to do is find the RESTful API application, and that is under Program Files, VMware, and then VMware Workstation. And if we do a find string on VMRest, it is this guy here. So what I recommend is adding this to the path, and you can do that by... So I recommend adding this directory to your environmental path. And on Windows, you can do that pretty easily just by grabbing this. Then the command is $env for environmental, and then path. And we want to add, so we're going to do a plus and equals so that we don't wipe out our existing path. And then we need a quote and a semicolon to add a new entry. And then we will paste that in. And then we will close the quote. And this will add the VMware Workstation to the path. I actually already have that done. We can see that by going echo environmental path. And it is this guy right here. If you want a more permanent solution, you can go to your system in Windows and then go Advanced System Settings. And then under environmental variables, there is the path there where you can edit and add the location for you. However you do it, we will now be able to run the VMRest command. And what I'm going to do is just say -- help. So we need to do a few things here. The first thing is we need to do the configuration, and this is going to store the credential that we use to log into the API. And then we need to give it a certificate, a key to that certificate, and let it know what IP address to use. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and create a directory, and I'm just going to call this certs. And then I'm going to hop over to my Ubuntu shell. And what we'll do is, for my Ubuntu shell, I'm just going to connect to that folder I created. So that's going to be cd mnt c certs. And then we're going to use OpenSSL to create that self-signed certificate. So that's going to be OpenSSL. It's going to be a request. It's going to be x509. And then we're going to say it's SHA-256, just because that's what we're supposed to be using nowadays. We are going to say no des because we don't want a password. It's going to be a new key, which is going to be RSA with 4096 bits. And then the key out is just going to be VMware key.pem. And then the actual certificate will be VMware crt.pem. And then this cert is going to last for 365 days. Next is going to ask us for my information. You can type in anything you want here. And it's going to say Canada, Alberta, Calgary, Test Lab, IT, And this is actually going to be desktop01.testlab.com. Don't need an email. And there we go. So if I do an ls, there's our certs. So I'll go back to our PowerShell here, and we'll get in that directory. And the first thing we want to do is just run that configuration. So I'll say VM rest -C for config, and we need to give it a username. This could be anything you want. I'm just going to call it admin. And then we need a reasonably secure password. So I'm going to say meowcat123 $. If you don't type a password that it likes, it's going to basically make you enter a new one. Or if you don't type the password correctly, that also helps. Third time's a charm. There we go. So now that password is set, we can now tell it to use those certificates and my IP address. So I'm going to say vmrest -C is going to be VMware CRT. And then -K is going to be the key. And then -I is going to be my IP address. Now, if you don't enter an IP address, it is going to be just the local host, which is fine if you're doing your scripting from the computer. But if you want to access it from across the network, then you need an IP address in here. So I'll hit enter. And in a perfect world, our API should be running. In a browser, we go to the IP address and then 8697. And we have to accept the cert because it's just self-signed. And here is our API. The first thing we need to do in this particular API is we need to click on authorization and tell it the username and password. Most APIs have one way or another for you to authenticate, but what this does is lets you navigate the API without using any command line tools, which is always pretty handy. So in here we can do things like check out the networking, we can check out what VMs we have, and we can check the power state. And if we look, we can see that there's a structure to these. So the VMs is going to list all the VMs. And then if we want more detail, we need the ID from that output so that we can drill down and do some operations there. So let's just go to our VMs here and we can click on try it out. And then what we get is it tells us the curl command that we can use. We'll be talking about that in a sec, but this is an example of a command line utility. It lets us know what the request URL is, and then it gives us the answers there. So each of my VMs, and I have quite a few in here, have an ID and a path. So the idea here is that we need the IP to reference this for other things. So if I do a search here for CSR31, this is one of my routers. So I'm going to copy this ID. So what I can do is I can click on the more specific one that requires the ID field. And then for parameters, I can enter in that ID I copied. And if I try this out, it is going to give us more details because we're drilling down. What I could also do is go under power management and say get the power state of that VM, try it out. And we can see it's powered off right now. If we wanted to turn this on, we could look at the example of how to do a put statement. And then we can enter in the ID here, followed by telling it what we're actually doing. So we can see here that the model just says on, so we need to type on here. If we try this out, we can see that the router is booting. By the way, if you have the UI open while you're doing API operations, you can have some weirdness. That's why you saw that the router tab closed and I had to reopen it. So you might want to actually close the GUI while you're doing some scripting, or you can get some weirdness. But I'm going to keep it open for the duration just so we can try and get some quick results. And if we want to turn that off, all I need to do is set this to off and say try it out. And now if I click back on this one, we can see that it's turned off. Most vendor solutions do have some sort of API explorer where you can see what APIs are available and test them out dynamically. You can see here that it tells you a lot of information like what the expected response messages are if things aren't working. If I had a wrong password, I would get a 403 permission denied. And it also lets you know exactly what information it's expecting from you here. So you can see here that in the model example, it wants a name and it wants a parent ID. So we can use this to understand what we're doing. So let's just go back to our get VMs. And if we click on try it out one more time, we can see that it generates a curl command, which is a command line utility for interacting with HTTP. And this is a method just for doing some quick and dirty RESTful API interactions. The curl command points to the API URL. It is doing a get operation. The header that it's accepting is particular to VMware there. Other headers that you might expect to see is application-JSON or XML. And we can see that it has encoded our username and password into this base 64. And the reason it does that is not so much for security, it's so that if you have a complex password, it doesn't mess with the URL, because this ultimately is HTTP communication. So if I copy this, and we'll work from my Ubuntu shell, go back to my home directory. If I paste this in, we'll get an error because my Ubuntu shell doesn't trust that certificate because it's self-signed. So rather than deal with importing certificates for everything I want to do, the easiest way to handle this is to go to curl and just say -k for insecure. So now if I enter this, we get the same information. We get the same information that we had with the API Explorer. The difference is that we can now use the OS tools that Linux and Windows provides to start working with this data. So for example, if I wanted to, I could pipe this into a tool called JQ. Apparently I don't have this installed. I just rebuilt my shell to Ubuntu 20, so bear with me 1 second. Let's try that again. And we can see that from our perspective, it just looks a little bit prettier because it's now in color, but if I wanted to, I could start using JQ to start extracting particular fields or whatnot. We don't need to get into that right now. Curl is supported by PowerShell, by the way, so if I wanted to grab this command and open up another PowerShell, we can also work with that here. We can also do the same command here, but we'll talk about that a bit later. Now, what if you wanted to decode this string here? Now, if you need to encode your own username and password as a base 64, what you can do is, I'm just going to copy this for reference. What we can do is we can type in echo, and then we want -n to allow for the new line. And then we type in our username, :password. And we can pipe this into base 64. After we do that, we can see that we have the same value. Now, if I forget this -n, this is not going to be the same value because it is appending the new line character. A great thing about working with RESTful API is that we can interact with it with any command line utility or programming language that supports HTTP, which is pretty much every one of them. We often play with Python, and we'll be doing that as we get towards the end of this video. But just for a change of pace, let's have a look at PowerShell for a change. And this is actually a little bit more annoying than what we've been playing with, but it's always fun to see something new. So the first thing we do is we need to get that base 64 value. So we need to do that, and we'll do that by creating a variable. So I'm just going to call this basic auth. And then there's a PowerShell function that we can use, which is convert. to base 64 string. And then it is going to be text encoding. And it is going to be ASCII. So that is a bit of a mouthful. And then what we need to do is we need to tell it our username and password, which is admin and then meowcat123$. And if I didn't make any typos, we should be able to say echo basic off. And we can see we have the same value here. So we'll also need to make a variable for our headers. Otherwise it's going to get pretty unreadable. So basically what we're saying here is that we're taking the variable value from here and then we're appending it so it's going to read basic and then the variable value. Oh, I forgot to close my function here. There we go. There we go. Had a slight typo there. And if we look at this, we now have a name value pair where we have our authorization and then basic in our value here. So we're just building the components of what we need. I did mention that we do have the curl command, but instead we're going to use the proper PowerShell commandlet, which is invoke web request. And then we need the URI, so I'm actually just going to go back to our page here and I'm going to grab it from here, the request URL. And then we're going to skip the certificate check, that's the -k in curl. Our content type, I am just going to grab from here because I don't feel like typing this much. And then the headers is going to be our headers variable. So we should be able to give this a go. I'll hit enter. And we see it work, but we don't necessarily see our values here. We have them embedded here if you notice here. So what we could do is we could work with PowerShell on this if we wanted to. For example, I could pipe this into format list and I could say raw content and we'll get all our information. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put this into another variable and I'm just going to call this response. And if I wanted to, I could say echo response. And we have all our information. We can start drilling down from there. So what I'll do is I'm just going to grab that ID for that CSR router. And we're going to have one more variable. We're going to call this the VM ID. And now, if we just edit this a little bit, we want our VM ID here, and we want power. Now, we need to change the method because we're not just getting anymore. This is going to be put, and again, we can check that web API for reference, and then we could say body on. You can see that our CSR should be booting up here, and yes it is. And again, if we want to turn this off, we can just say off. So hopefully you're starting to see that it's, aside from some syntax differences, it's actually pretty easy to get what you want with a RESTful API. But working with command line isn't really practical while you're sorting things out. A better total manager APIs is Postman, which lets you organize your various queries into collections and lets you do more automation testing. For example, I've went ahead and added a bunch of vendors, including Cisco and so on and so forth, but I've also added the VMware Workstation stuff. And we can see here under Get VMs, we have our request URL. I've set the headers and any other parameters that we need. I can just go ahead and hit send here. I actually changed the password last minute there, so I'm going to edit it here by going to authorization. And before I had 1, 2, 3 exclamation point, but I just need to change this to $. And now if I hit send, we should get our response in a nice little format. And the beauty of this tool is it makes it really easy to look at your results and manipulate the data. It also keeps it nice and contained there, so you can come back to this later without having to remember all your various queries. If you want to, you can also generate code for you. So, for example, here is an example of the curl command that we're playing with there that we can just copy and paste, and this should work. So I'm just going to copy this. And if we wanted to, we could paste it under here, and then we can do a -K for insecure. And that works. So that's a way of helping get your automation off the ground. In addition to curl, we can do C if we wanted to there. We could do go. We just looked at Powershell, and here is using the REST method. This is very similar to what I just did with you. And we can also do help you get started with Python. I've thrown together a quick and easy Python script. It's probably not going to win any awards, but it's enough to show you some of the power of API. So what I've done here is I've imported requests so I can work with the API. I've imported JSON so I can work with the JSON format. I imported the URL lib so that I could disable the certificate checks. And then I also imported regex there so I can do some filtering stuff. After that, I've set some variables such as the base URL, the username, password, and what headers to accept, and created a list there what is going to be populated by my loops. So the basic logic here is if we scroll down, under the main function, it is going to ask me what state the power should be, and it's going to support on, off, or suspend. And then it is going to run a get VM function and store it into a VM list, which is a variable that is a list function. So if we scroll up to our get VPN, I keep saying VPN, get VM, we can see that what I'm doing is we are appending VMs to the base URL, and the VM name is going to start with CSR. And what we're doing is we're doing the request. And then if the request is successful, it is taking the result, dumping it into JSON so I can work with it. And then I'm looping for the result so that, and what we're doing here is we're saying if the virtual machine name starts or has CSR in the name, then we're going to append it to the list and we're going to return that. Once that's returned, we're going to say for every VM in that list, we're going to run another function, VM operation, using the provided power operation that we got from our input here. And then in this function, we are setting we're adding power to the URL, so we're accessing those functions. We are specifying the VM ID is this parameter in JSON. And then for the rest of it, I'm doing some regex so I can match the VM names. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to make our request, and if it is powered on, it's going to say it's powered on the VM. If it's powered off, it's going to say it's powering off the VM. And if it's suspended, it's going to say suspended. Otherwise, it's going to return a failure. I know that's a lot to go over in a short amount of time, but what we can do is just go ahead and run this and see what it looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and say run and VM control. And we see here is asking me what state should the VMs be, on, off, or suspend. I'm going to say on. And we can see that all the VMs have powered up except for this guy, but this actually has some kind of problem I need to fix later. See, it's in an inconsistent power state. If we look back on our script, we can see that it said it's powered up everything else. I didn't do any advanced error checking to find out that this didn't actually power up, so I could approve that if I wanted to. If we run this again, and we say we want it off, we can see that everything is now powered off. So while this might not be the most practical example in the world, hopefully you see the value in using APIs to make your life a little bit easier. Even if it's just starting up a bunch of VMs at once there, because you can't be annoyed to right-click too many times. If I want to start it, I can just type a few words, or if I wanted to be a bit more automatic, I could remove this input entirely, and I could just have a script that automatically starts VMs as soon as I run it, and I could call it however I want to. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.